The first time Edgar Alden rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, he told himself it would be the last town he ever let himself linger in. And then he saw the woman standing on the steps of the Meridian Hotel with a busted carpetbag at her feet and fire in her eyes. And he knew, even before he knew her name, that something about this particular stopping point was going to cost him more than the price of a room. Caldwell was a cattle town, the kind that breathed dust and money in equal measure. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who couldn't decide whether to walk away or stay rooted, and most of the people who passed through it were of the same undecided nature. Cowboys came through with trail-sore horses and jangling pockets. Merchants arrived with wagons and left with empty ones. Land speculators arrived with dreams and left with sunburns. Everybody was passing through, and that suited Edgar Alden just fine, because passing through was the only thing he was still genuinely good at. He was 31 years old, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by weather rather than born into the world. Lean through the jaw, serious through the brow, with eyes that were a particular shade of brown that people sometimes described as warm and other times described as guarded, depending on how long they had tried to hold his gaze. He wore a gray duster that had been better days and a hat that had been through 3 different states. He carried a Winchester on his saddle and a Colt at his hip, and a past he did not discuss with anyone ever, under any circumstances. He had been a cattle driver. He had been a ranch hand. He had been briefly a deputy in a small town in the Texas Panhandle whose name he no longer said aloud. He had been, for one terrible winter, nothing at all, just a man drifting between one nowhere and the next. What he had not been in over 10 years was anything that resembled settled. The woman on the hotel steps was not settled either, though she very clearly wanted to be. She had dark auburn hair that the Kansas wind was doing its absolute best to destroy, and she was fighting it with one hand while using the other to try to coax a leather strap back around the broken clasp of her carpetbag. She was wearing a practical brown traveling dress that had seen better days, but she wore it with the kind of dignity that made it look intentional rather than worn. She was, Edgar estimated, somewhere around 26 or 27, though there was something in the set of her chin that made her seem simultaneously younger and older than whatever number was attached to her. She lost the fight with the strap just as he was riding past. The carpetbag fell open on the step, and what had been packed inside, a hairbrush, a book, a folded piece of paper that scattered in the breeze, tumbled out across the wooden boards of the hotel porch. Edgar Alden pulled his horse to a stop. He did not know why he did it. He had ridden past people with worse problems and not slowed down. It was something about the way she looked at the scattered belongings. Not with defeat, not with tears, but with a kind of furious resignation, like a woman who had been inconvenienced by the universe too many times to be surprised, but was still deeply, personally offended by it. He stepped down from the saddle and hitched his horse to the post without being asked. "Let me," he said, which were the first 2 words he spoke to Pearl Beckett. She looked up at him with eyes that were green and suspicious and not remotely grateful yet. "I can manage," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said, and crouched down anyway to catch the piece of paper before the wind took it past the edge of the porch. She watched him gather it and fold it carefully and hold it out to her. She looked at the paper, then at him, and some small calculation happened behind those green eyes. "Thank you," she said, taking it from his hand with deliberate care, making sure their fingers did not touch. "The strap's not going to hold," he said, looking at the bag. "I'm aware. There's a leather shop 2 streets over, Holt's. He can fix that clasp in about 20 minutes for 15 cents. She looked at the bag. She looked at the street. She looked at him again. "And who are you to know so much about the town you just rode into?" He raised an eyebrow. "How do you know I just rode in?" "Because your horse has trail dust on its flanks and you have it on your collar, and you looked at this street like a man trying to read a map, not like a man who knows where he's going." He said nothing for a moment. Then, Edgar Alden. She stood up straight and tucked the piece of paper inside her dress pocket. Pearl Beckett. Where are you coming from, Miss Beckett? Missouri, she said. And where are you going, Mr. Alden? West, he said, which was the answer he always gave because west was not a destination, it was a direction, and directions didn't demand explanations. She seemed to understand that. She looked west herself for a moment, down the length of the main street of Caldwell with its saloons and its dry goods store and its cattle pens in the distance sending a smell on the wind that was unmistakable and unavoidable. Then she looked back at him. I'm staying, she said. Here, in Caldwell. He didn't say anything to that. My uncle left me a piece of land east of town, she continued, and he didn't know why she was telling him this except that she seemed like a woman who had spent a long time not being able to say it aloud and now needed to say it to someone, even a stranger. He passed in February. I've come to see what there is to be done with it. Land east of town, he repeated, near the creek. I don't know exactly. I have the deed. She touched her pocket. He understood now what the folded paper was. I haven't been out to see it yet. I arrived this morning. The land east of the creek is good land, he said. The soil has some quality to it, better than the flats. She looked at him with those careful green eyes. You seem to know a lot about land you've only just seen. I've driven cattle through a lot of places. You learn to read land. He picked up her carpetbag and held it out to her. Holtz is on Banner Street, 2 left turns. She took the bag. For a moment she stood there looking at him like she was solving a problem she hadn't expected to encounter, and then she said, Would you like a cup of coffee, Mr. Alden? The hotel has a dining room. It's the least I can do. He should have said no. He had learned over a long decade of wandering that saying yes to things that felt like beginnings only led to difficult endings. But the wind had turned and it was carrying the smell of the cattle pens away from them, and the afternoon light was falling on Caldwell in a way that made even a dust-caked cattle town look like something worth pausing in, and so Edgar Alden said yes. He told himself it was just coffee. The dining room of the Meridian Hotel was nothing grand, 4 tables covered in oilcloth, a counter with a percolator, and a large window that looked out onto the main street. But it was warm in a way that the outdoors of Caldwell rarely managed to be, and the coffee that arrived in a chipped ceramic cup was strong enough to hold a spoon upright, which was the only kind Edgar respected. Pearl sat across from him with her own cup and her damaged carpetbag on the floor beside her chair and told him, in her direct, unsentimental way, the basic facts of her situation. Her uncle Emmett Beckett had been a farmer, or had tried to be, on 40 acres east of Caldwell near a bend in Bluff Creek. He had died in February with no wife and no children, and he had left the land and its modest improvements, a small house, a barn, some fencing to Pearl, who was his only surviving relative. Pearl had been in Missouri, working as a schoolteacher in the town of Hannibal. She had given her notice at the school, sold what she owned that would not fit in a carpetbag, and taken the train as far west as the line went and then ridden the rest of the way in a mail coach that had been aggressively uncomfortable. Are you planning to farm it? Edgar asked. I'm planning to try, she said with a frankness that he appreciated. Not I'm going to farm it, not it will be easy, just I'm planning to try. Do you know anything about farming? I grew up on a farm, she said. In Illinois, before my parents passed. I know enough to not be a complete fool about it. I know the difference between winter wheat and spring wheat. I know how to read a sky for rain. She wrapped both hands around her cup. What I don't know is what state my uncle left the property in, or how much work is needed, or whether the land has been sitting idle since February. She looked at him steadily. Have you ever worked a farm, Mr. Alden? I've worked cattle, he said. Some of it overlapped. Would you be interested in a job, she asked, and there it was direct, matter-of-fact, the way she seemed to do everything. I'll need hands. I have money enough to pay fair wages for a season while I get established. I'm not a rich woman, but I'm not without resources. He looked at her across the oilcloth table. He should have said no. He was going west. He had been going west for as long as he could remember, not because anything specific waited for him there, but because west was the direction you went when you had left everything else behind. He should have finished his coffee, wished her well, and ridden out of Caldwell the next morning. "I'll think on it," he said instead, and that was more than he had offered anyone in years. That night he took a room at the hotel, not the Meridian, which was Pearl's hotel, but the smaller, rougher Grand Continental 2 blocks north, which charged 30 cents a night and didn't ask questions. He lay on the narrow bed and listened to Caldwell make its nighttime sounds, the distant noise of the saloons, the lowing of cattle in the pens, the wind moving through the gaps in the building, and he thought about what it would mean to take the job she was offering. He thought about the last time he had been in one place long enough to learn its rhythms. He thought about Millbrook, Texas, the small town where he had worked as deputy for nearly 2 years, where he had built something that resembled a life, a rented room, a routine. A woman named Clara Hodges who had brown hair and a gentle laugh, and who had been planning to marry him before everything fell apart in the winter of 1871. That was more than 10 years ago. He had not been back to Millbrook. He had not written to anyone there. He had not, in all the years since, allowed himself to use the word that Clara had used when she talked about what they were building together. The word that meant something specific and permanent and warm. The word that implied that a person belonged somewhere and that somewhere belonged back. He had not said that word in over a decade. He rolled onto his side and looked at the wall of his room in the Grand Continental Hotel in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, and he told himself that taking a job with Pearl Beckett would not require him to say any words he didn't want to say. In the morning, he went to Holt's leather shop on Banner Street and bought a new brass clasp of the right size, because the repair she would get there would be adequate, but the clasp was the wrong gauge for the weight of that bag, and it would fail again inside a month. Then he rode out to the land east of town before she did, just to see it for himself, because he could not make an honest decision without honest information. The 40 acres east of the bend in Bluff Creek were, as he had suspected, good land. The creek provided reliable water. The soil was dark and deep. The grass on the uncultivated portion was tall and healthy, which was a sign of what the land could support. Emmett Beckett had cultivated maybe a third of it before he died, and the fields had that particular look of land that had been worked but not recently. The winter had been hard, and nothing had been planted this spring. The small house was 2 rooms, sound in its walls but in need of some carpentry attention to the porch steps and the front door's leather hinges. The barn was older and better built than the house, which was often the way with practical men who understood priorities. There were the remains of a kitchen garden near the back of the house, and 3 apple trees that had survived the winter and were budding. Edgar rode the perimeter of the property on his horse, reading the land the way he had learned to read everything, quietly, carefully, without sentiment. And what he read was that this was a place that could work. With the right hands and the right effort and the right season, something real could come of it. He rode back into town. Pearl was on the steps of the Meridian again, the carpetbag beside her but now with a proper repair, and she was wearing a different dress, this one dark green, the color of creek water in shadow. She was talking to the hotel's proprietor about hiring a cart to take her and her things out to the property, and she looked up when she heard his horse. "Mr. Alden," she said. "Miss Beckett," he said. "I'll take the job." Something moved across her face, relief, carefully contained so it didn't become too visible. "Generous wages," she said. $30 a month with room and board." "The barn will do for room," he said. "The house needs the space." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Can you start today?" "I already started," he said. "I rode the property this morning. You'll need seed, wheat, and corn both. You'll need to replace the leather hinges on the front door before the season gets any wetter. The south fence near the creek has a 40-yard section that's down and will need to be walked and restaked." He paused. "And the step on the left side of the porch is rotted through. Mind how you step." Pearl Beckett looked at him for a long moment with those measuring green eyes. Then she said, 35 a month. 30 is fair, he said. 35 is what I'm offering. He let it go. The first afternoon on the Beckett property was spent in practical work, Edgar doing the heavy lifting on the south fence while Pearl walked the property with her deed, and a piece of paper she used to make notes, cataloging what was there and what was needed. They did not talk much that first afternoon. They were the kind of people who understood that work was a form of communication, and they communicated well. By evening she had her list and he had half the fence restaked, and they sat on the porch steps on the right side, away from the rotted one, and drank water from the creek that Pearl had boiled carefully on the small iron stove inside. "I'll need to go into town tomorrow for supplies," she said. "Seed especially. Atkins Dry Goods carries seed," he said. "Tell him what you're planting and he'll know what's available." She wrote that down on her paper. He watched her write and thought that she had good handwriting, the kind that came from years of teaching school, neat and even and purposeful. "You were a school teacher," he said. "For 3 years. Before that I was a student. Before that I was a farmer's daughter." She finished writing and looked up at the creek in the fading light. It ran behind the property, visible through a screen of cottonwood trees, and the sound of it was low and continuous and restful in a way that Edgar noticed without intending to. "You were a cattle driver, among other things." "What other things?" He looked at his hands, at the raw spots from the fence wire and the permanent calluses from a decade of rope work. "This and that," he said. She accepted that without pushing. He appreciated it. They were quiet for a while, listening to the creek and the early evening birds. Then Pearl said, "It's strange to be here." She was not speaking to him exactly, more to the air in front of her. "I've never been to Kansas before. My uncle wrote letters," he described the place, the light especially, how it was different from Illinois or Missouri. "I used to read those letters and think I understood what he meant." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't." "The light is different," Edgar said. "It's larger," she said. "That sounds foolish." "It doesn't." She looked at him sideways, surprised that he had agreed so readily, and something small but real shifted between them. Some first acknowledgement that they were talking to each other rather than just near each other. "Tomorrow I'll go into town for seed," she said again firmly, returning to practicality. "And I'll see about hiring a second hand. You mentioned I'd need help." "One more would do it for now," he said. "Ask at the feed store. There are usually men looking for seasonal work." She nodded and wrote something else on her paper. That night she slept in her uncle's house, in the small back room that had a narrow bed and a window that faced the apple trees. Edgar took the barn, where he laid out his bedroll in the clean hay, and listened to the creek and his horse shifting in the neighboring stall, and found, to his moderate surprise, that he slept better than he had in months. The second day began early. Pearl was up before the sun, which Edgar only discovered because he was also up before the sun, which was an old habit from years of cattle work that his body had apparently not abandoned. He came out of the barn into the gray pre-dawn and found her already in the kitchen garden, crouched over the old beds, turning the soil with a small-handled spade and examining what the winter had left behind. "The garlic survived," she said, without looking up. She must have heard his boots on the ground. "And there's what looks like it might be onion sets that I missed. Everything else will need replanting." "Morning," he said. She looked up. Her hair was loose. She hadn't yet put it up for the day, and it fell around her shoulders in a way that the rising light caught and turned almost copper. She looked in that unguarded early moment softer than she had yesterday, less armored. "Good morning," she said. He went to the well and drew water and started the fire for the stove while she finished in the garden. She came inside with soil on her gloves, and her face flushed from the cold morning air, and he had coffee started, and she stood across the small kitchen from him. And there was something almost unbearably domestic about it that he did not examine too closely. "I want to see the whole property again today," she said, pulling off her gloves. "Properly, take notes. Understand what we're working with before I go into town for seed." "I can walk it with you," he said. "I'd appreciate that." They walked the 40 acres in the cool of the morning, Edgar explaining what he had seen the day before, Pearl asking questions that were sharp and specific and demonstrated that she had, as she said, grown up with farmland and understood more than a novice would. She had particular interest in the creek access, in the drainage of the lower field, in the condition of the soil near the tree line. She had questions about the well's depth and the reliability of the creek in summer. He answered what he knew and told her honestly when he didn't know. By mid-morning they were back at the house, and Pearl was making additions to her notes, seated at the small table inside by the window, and Edgar was working on the porch step with a piece of board he had found in the barn. He was replacing the rotted board, fitting the new piece in and tapping it level, when he heard Pearl say something inside the house. She was talking to herself, or rather talking to her notes, the way people did when they were working through a problem. And he caught, through the open window above him, the words she used. "When I get this place properly running," she was saying to herself and to the paper, her voice thoughtful and unself-conscious, "it could really be a home." The word fell through the window and hit Edgar Alden somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum. Home. She had said it so easily, so casually, the way you said any word that cost you nothing. Home. As if it were simple, as if it were a thing a person just was or had or made. She had been here one night, and she was already using that word in the same tone a person used to describe weather or bread or any ordinary, available thing. He set down his hammer. He stood up from the porch step. He walked off the porch and around the side of the house and kept walking until he reached the cottonwood trees at the edge of the creek. And he stood there with his back to the property and his hands at his sides, looking at the water. The creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones and did not care about anything he was feeling. The cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out, small pale green leaves trembling in a breeze that was cool and smelled of water and new growth. It was a beautiful morning. He was aware that it was a beautiful morning in the way a man is aware of something that he is not sure he deserves to be standing in the middle of. Home. He had last said that word in Millbrook, Texas, in the autumn of 1870. He and Clara Hodges standing outside the house. She had pointed to a small house on the south end of town with a kitchen garden and 2 windows, and Clara saying, "We could make that a home, Edgar, we really could." And he had said it back to her, "Yes, we could make it a home." And then the winter had come, and his deputy partner Tom Reese had been shot during a botched robbery attempt on the town's small bank, and Edgar had gone after the men responsible, and the pursuit had gone badly sideways in ways he still did not entirely want to think about. And when he came back to Millbrook, Clara Hodges was gone, not dead, just gone, moved east to her sister's in Arkansas, because she had waited 3 months, and the man she had wanted to build something with had turned himself into something else, something harder and more distant that she did not recognize. And Edgar had stayed in Millbrook for another month, rattling around the edges of the life he had been building, and then one morning he had saddled his horse and ridden west. He had not said the word since. He stood at the edge of Bluff Creek in the Kansas spring and breathed. Pearl Beckett had been here one day and a morning, and she had said the word as if it were nothing. As if words like that were just available to people, as if you could just pick them up and use them and put them down again without paying any price. He stood there for a long time. When he walked back to the house, Pearl was outside on the porch, the good side, not the rotted step, and she was looking in the direction of the creek with an expression that was careful and not quite casual. She had heard him leave, he understood. She was not the kind of person who missed things. She did not ask him where he had gone. She said, "I found some coffee left in the tin. Do you want some before I ride into town?" He said, "Yes." She went inside and poured it and brought it out and handed it to him and sat on the porch rail, and neither of them said anything about what had just happened, and he was grateful for that in a way he could not have explained. But she had noticed. He was certain she had noticed, because Pearl Beckett noticed things, and because when she handed him the cup she looked at him for just a moment, not with pity, not with curiosity, just with a quiet steadiness that said, "I see you, and I am not going to make it worse." He did not know, sitting there on that porch in the Kansas morning, that he was already halfway in love with her. He would not know it for some time yet. He was not the kind of man who recognized the condition of his own heart quickly. But something had begun, and the beginning of it was that word she had said without knowing what it cost, and the look she had given him when she handed him the coffee afterward. He went into town with her that morning rather than staying at the property, because it made practical sense to have someone who could load supplies. That was what he told himself. They rode side by side into Caldwell on a morning that had warmed into something genuinely lovely, with cloud shadows moving across the flat Kansas plain and the smell of the prairie grass sharp and clean in the air. At Atkins' dry goods store, Pearl conducted herself with a brisk competence that Edgar found satisfying to watch. She had her list. She knew what she needed. She asked intelligent questions and accepted the answers that made sense and gently, but firmly rejected the ones that didn't. Atkins, who was a stout man with opinions about how women ought to conduct themselves in business transactions, made the mistake of suggesting she let Edgar make the final decisions on seed quality. And Pearl turned a very specific shade of polite that was actually fairly impolite, and explained, crisply, that she was the proprietor of the property, and she was perfectly capable of determining the quality of the corn seed he was offering, which she did by opening the sack herself and examining a handful. Edgar stood slightly behind her and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. At the feed store, they found a possible second hand. His name was Caleb Dorn, a local man of about 40 with a sun-cracked face and straightforward manner who had wintered in Caldwell and was looking for seasonal work before the cattle drive started coming through. He knew the area, knew the soil east of the creek, and had worked grain crops before. Pearl talked to him for 10 minutes and hired him on the spot. "You work fast," Edgar told her as they loaded the cart. "I work efficiently," she said, which was a distinction she apparently felt was important. They drove back to the property with the cart loaded with seed and some additional tools, and a crate of provisions that Pearl had purchased at the general store: flour, salt, canned goods, a jar of molasses, a block of cheese wrapped in cloth, 2 tins of coffee. When they had unloaded everything, Pearl stood in the middle of the yard with her hands on her hips and looked at the house and the barn and the fields with an expression that Edgar could only describe as resolved. "All right," she said to herself and to him equally. "We have a lot of work to do." "We do," he agreed. "And we should get started," she said. "We should," he said, and they did. The weeks that followed were shaped entirely by work. The kind that started before the light was full and ended after it was gone. The kind that used a body up so completely that sleep came quickly and without argument. Caleb Dorn joined them and proved to be a solid worker who understood what he was asked and did it without the need for much direction. The 3 of them planted the fields in sections. First the winter wheat that had been missed by the season and would need to establish before the summer heat came on. Then the corn in the richer lower field near the creek. Edgar repaired the porch and the door and found, in the course of doing so, that the east wall of the house had a section of timber that had been weakening for several seasons and needed to be shored up before the summer storms tested it. He repaired that too. He found that he was better at the carpentry than he had expected to be, or perhaps better than he had been before. There was something about being in a specific place and knowing he was going to be there for a specific amount of time that sharpened his attention. Pearl ran the household with the same efficient intelligence she applied to everything else. She was not a woman who believed that keeping a house was beneath her or above her. It was simply part of the work that needed doing, and she did it with the same directness she brought to everything. The kitchen came alive under her attention. The garden was replanted methodically, row by row, and within 3 weeks was showing green in tidy lines. She repaired things she could repair and asked for help with the things she couldn't, and she always acknowledged clearly when a thing had been done well. One evening in early May, about 3 weeks after Edgar had arrived, Pearl brought supper out to the porch: beans and cornbread and sliced salt pork. And they ate outside because the evening was warm and the light was extraordinary. The Kansas sky doing what it did sometimes in late spring, turning colors at sunset that had no names in the ordinary vocabulary. "Do you want to talk about it?" Pearl said, when they had been sitting in silence for long enough that it had become a comfortable silence rather than an avoidant one. He looked at her. "About what?" She held his gaze. "About why you left the room on the second day." He looked at his plate. He said nothing for a moment. "I was not trying to pry," she said, and her voice was gentle in the way it sometimes was when she was being most precise. "I've simply noticed that you are a man who has packed himself up very carefully, and I've wondered what happened that made that necessary." He set his fork down. The sunset was orange and deep rose, and the creek in the middle distance was catching the color of it, and the apple trees were in full blossom now, white flowers nodding in the light evening breeze, and he thought, of all the places to be asked this question, this is a kinder setting than most. "There was a town," he said, "in Texas, Millbrook. I was a deputy there for almost 2 years." She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he had come to rely on about her. "There was a woman," he said, "Clara. We were going to build something together. We talked about it, used words like—" He stopped. Words that meant permanent things. "Home," Pearl said quietly, not a question. He looked at her. "Yes." She held his gaze and did not look away. "Something happened," he said. "A robbery. My partner was shot. I went after the men responsible and it went wrong. Not violent wrong, just wrong, in ways that changed what I was for a while. And when I came back, she was gone. And I stayed a month and then I left, and I've been leaving ever since." He picked up his fork again. "That's the shape of it." Pearl was quiet for a moment. The sunset was moving through its changes, the orange deepening toward purple at the edges of the sky. "Do you still love her?" Pearl asked, and the question was direct but not unkind. It was the question that mattered, and she asked it because she was a person who asked the questions that mattered. "No," he said, and it was true, he realized as he said it. What he had felt for Clara Hodges had not been wrong, and it had been real, but it had been more than 10 years ago, and the man who had felt it was not exactly the same man sitting on this porch. "I stopped loving her a long time ago. I just never stopped carrying the piece of the story where I said goodbye to the idea of that kind of thing." Pearl absorbed this carefully. "That's a heavy thing to carry," she said. "You get used to the weight," he said. "Or you think you do," she said, very gently. He did not answer that because she was right, and he knew she was right, and some truths don't require a response. They finished their supper in the warm-colored evening, and after Caleb Dorn had gone home to his rented room in town, he rode in and out daily. Preferring to board in Caldwell, Edgar helped Pearl carry the dishes inside. She washed them at the basin and handed them to him to dry without discussion, as if this had always been their system, and maybe it had been by then, 3 weeks in. His hands knew the shape of those plates. Her hands knew the rhythm of washing them. It was the kind of domestic knowledge that accumulated without announcement. When the dishes were done, she said good night, and he said good night, and he walked to the barn. He lay in the hay and looked up at the barn ceiling and understood, with a clarity that was uncomfortable, that he was in love with Pearl Beckett. He had tried not to be. He had been careful, the way a man who has been burned once is careful near fire, keeping a precise professional distance, addressing everything in terms of the work, not looking at her for too long in the evenings when the light was kind to her. But there had been the conversation on the porch, and the way she had asked the hard question directly and waited for the honest answer without flinching. There had been the 3 weeks of working beside her, of watching her intelligence applied to every problem, of seeing her laugh genuinely when Caleb Dorn told a particularly bad joke, of noticing the way she looked at her apple trees when she thought no one was watching, with a tenderness that the practical surface of her personality only occasionally let through. He was in love with her, and he did not know what to do about it. He also understood that she had said home, and that hearing it had driven him out of the room, and that she knew it had, and that she had asked him about it directly, which meant she was not unaware of him either. But Pearl Beckett was a precise woman, and she was not the kind of person who would say a thing she didn't know to be true, and she was not going to say anything until she knew. He closed his eyes and listened to the creek, and thought that Bluff Creek was an extremely inconvenient place to fall in love. June arrived with heat, and the first real test of the Kansas summer, which was both fiercer and more beautiful than it had any right to be. The wheat was establishing well in the fields. The corn was rising in the lower field with the particular robust confidence of corn that has found good soil and adequate water. The kitchen garden was producing lettuce and early onions and the first of the garlic. The apple trees were past their blossoms and beginning to set fruit. Caleb Dorn, who had been told the arrangement was seasonal, came to Pearl one morning in mid-June and told her he had been offered a place on a trail crew heading north and he was going to take it. She thanked him honestly, paid him his full wages plus 2 additional days, and shook his hand. He left on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she and Edgar were alone on the 40 acres. It was different, being only 2, not in any way he could specifically object to. They worked the same. The days had the same shape. But there was a quality to the evenings on the porch that had shifted, a density to the silence between them that was neither uncomfortable nor exactly comfortable, but charged, the way the air gets before a thunderstorm. One evening in late June, when the heat had finally broken toward sundown and they were sitting on the porch in the cooling air, Pearl put down the journal she had been writing in. She kept careful records of the farm's progress, dates and measurements and weather observations, and she said, "You've been thinking about leaving." It was not a question. He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "You've been looking at the road in the mornings," she said. "The way you did when you first arrived. Like a man calculating the distance." He had been. He had been because being in love with someone and not knowing what to do about it was a kind of pressure that his body apparently expressed through the instinct to move. "I'm not going to leave," he said. She looked at him with those steady green eyes. "Because of the farm or because of something else?" He held her gaze for a long moment. The last of the day's light was amber and soft, and it fell across the boards of the porch, and across the front of her dark green dress, and across her face, and she was watching him with the same clarity and patience she brought to every hard thing. "Something else," he said. She was quiet for a moment. A whippoorwill started up somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, and the creek answered in its low, continuous way. "Edgar," she said. His name in her voice it did something to him that he could not fully describe, even internally. She had called him by his first name once or twice in the past weeks, testing it out, and each time it had felt like a door opening by another inch. "Pearl," he said. "When you left the room," she said, "on the second day, when I said that word, I knew something about you from the way you left. I didn't know what exactly. But I knew it was the word that did it, not the idea of the thing, and I thought about that." She paused. "I thought about it a great deal." "I imagine you did," he said, because she thought about everything a great deal, which was one of the things he loved about her. "I think that what you're afraid of," she said carefully, "is not actually that word. I think what you're afraid of is saying it yourself, letting yourself mean it again." He looked away from her, toward the creek, toward the cottonwoods that were dark against the pale evening sky. "I think," she continued, "that you came here and you stayed and you put the porch board right and you replanted my south fence and you told me about the soil quality and about Atkins dry goods and about 1,000 other practical things. And I think the reason you did all of it is the same reason you can't look at me right now." He looked back at her. "I am a person who has also been careful," she said. "I am a person who chose to come west and build something rather than stay safe in Missouri. And I am a person who understands that building things requires a willingness to be uncertain about outcomes." She clasped her hands in her lap. "I am telling you this because I think you need to hear it from someone. I am not asking you to say anything you don't know to be true. I am only telling you that I am not fragile and I am not going anywhere and you are not going to frighten me by having feelings." He looked at her for a long time. "Pearl," he said, "I've been in love with you since about the 3rd week of April." She breathed, just slightly. "I've been in love with you," she said, "since you picked up my deed from the porch of the Meridian Hotel and folded it carefully before you handed it back." He stood up. She stood up. They were on the same porch they had been sitting on for 2 months, under the same Kansas sky, and he crossed the 3 feet between them. And when she raised her face to his, he understood that this was the beginning of the only kind of thing worth building. He kissed her. She kissed him back. It was not a desperate kiss or a hesitant one. It was the kind of kiss that two people who have been honest with each other share, certain and genuine and thorough, tasting of the summer evening and the strong coffee they had drunk at supper, and something that did not have a name in the ordinary vocabulary. When they parted, she kept her hands where they had gone, flat against his chest, and he kept his where they had gone, gentle at her waist, and they looked at each other in the last of the daylight. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She almost smiled. He almost smiled. Then she did smile truly, and it changed her face into something that was startlingly beautiful, and he thought, "There it is, that's the thing, that's what I've been circling for 2 months." They stood on the porch of the small house on the 40 acres east of Bluff Creek in the June evening, and the whippoorwill continued its announcement, and the creek continued its commentary, and the apple trees held their small green fruit up to the cooling air, and Edgar Alden thought for the first time in over a decade that he might be standing somewhere he did not want to leave. The weeks after that declaration were different, warm in a way that was not only the summer. There was a quality to working alongside someone you love that is entirely unlike working alongside someone you only respect, though respect is still present. It is something about awareness, the awareness of where they are relative to you, what their hands are doing, the sound of their voice, the small physical fact of their existence. Edgar had forgotten what it was like to work in the field of that kind of awareness, and he found it both wonderful and slightly disorienting, the way you feel when a room you've been in the dark of suddenly has light. He did not move into the house, that was not how things were done, and Pearl was a woman of good standing in a small community, and he was not going to do anything to jeopardize that. But the evenings on the porch were different, and the way they talked to each other was different. And once, on a warm July night when they had both come in from a day of particularly hard work in the corn fields and were at the kitchen table eating the meal she had put together quickly with tired hands, he reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it over in his and held it, and neither of them said anything. In July, a complication arrived. His name was Royce Callum, and he was a land speculator out of Wichita with a wide smile and a good horse, and documents that he claimed established a secondary claim on the eastern 12 acres of the Beckett property. Specifically, the stretch that included the best part of the lower corn field and the creek access. He came to the property on a Tuesday morning in his good suit and presented these documents to Pearl at the front door of the house with the smile of a man who expects to win by being pleasant. Pearl read the documents carefully, twice. Edgar stood in the yard behind Callum's horse and watched. "These documents reference a lien," Pearl said, "that my uncle Emmett Beckett apparently entered into in the winter of 1879 as collateral for a loan." "That's correct," Callum said. "The loan was never repaid and the lien transferred to me when I acquired the debt from the original lender." "What was the name of the original lender?" Pearl asked. Callum named a man. Edgar filed the name away. "And the amount of the original debt?" Pearl asked. Callum named an amount. Pearl showed nothing on her face, which Edgar read as the kind of effort that required work. "I'll need to consult with the county land office," Pearl said, "and I'll need to verify these documents independently." "Of course," Callum said with the smile of a man who believes the documents will hold up. "I'll be at the Meridian Hotel, no hurry." He rode off. Edgar came up to the porch. Pearl stood in the doorway holding the documents. "How serious is it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I intend to find out." She looked at him. "Did you know Emmett had debts?" "I never knew your uncle," he said. but a farmer alone on 40 acres in a hard winter is not unlikely to have borrowed. She absorbed this. "I need to go to Wichita," she said. "The county land office here won't have the full records." The original transaction would have been recorded in the Sumner County offices in Wellington, but the debt assignment might have more complete records in Wichita, where Callum is based. "That's a 3-day ride minimum," Edgar said. "I know," she said. "Will you stay with the property while I go?" "I'll come with you," he said. "Someone needs to be here," she said. "Then we'll find someone to stay," he said. "You shouldn't make that ride alone." She looked at him for a moment, and he could see the argument forming and also the moment when she decided against making it. "All right," she said, "but we need to be quick about it." They left the property 2 days later, after Edgar had arranged with a neighboring farmer named Haysworth to ride past daily and water the kitchen garden. They rode to Wellington first, where the Sumner County Land Office confirmed the lien, but also provided something Callum had not mentioned: a notation indicating that the original lender had accepted a partial repayment from Emmett Beckett in the spring of 1881, reducing the outstanding debt significantly. Callum had purchased the lien at what appeared to be the original figure, not the reduced one. In Wichita, which they reached after 2 hard days of riding with an overnight at a trail station between, Pearl took the documentation to a lawyer recommended by the proprietor of their boarding house. His name was Ambrose Tarrant, and he was a small, precise man with steel-rimmed spectacles and an opinion about everything and an immediately apparent genius for the details of property law. Tarrant spent an afternoon with the documents and came out of his office with the expression of a man who has found something worth finding. "The lien, as presented by Mr. Callum, includes the full original debt figure," Tarrant said, "but the notation from the Wellington records clearly shows partial payment accepted in April of 1881. Under Kansas statute, a lien that does not accurately reflect the reduced outstanding balance at the time of transfer is legally challengeable." Furthermore, he added, adjusting his spectacles with one finger, "the transfer document Callum provided does not include the endorsement of the Sumner County Register, which is required for lien transfers on agricultural land established under the 1873 homestead provisions." Pearl looked at Edgar. Edgar looked at Pearl. "So the claim is invalid?" Pearl asked. "The claim as presented is challengeable, and in my professional opinion will not survive a formal contest," Tarrant said. "I would advise you to file a formal objection with the county register, which I can draft for you today, and present it to Mr. Callum with a notice that you intend to contest it. In my experience, gentlemen of his particular type of enterprise often find it more profitable to move on to less complicated circumstances than to pursue a legal challenge they are unlikely to win." Pearl folded her hands on Tarrant's desk. "Please draft the objection." Tarrant drafted it. Pearl signed it. She paid his fee from the money she carried in a flat purse inside her traveling coat and shook his hand. They rode back to Caldwell the following 2 days, and Edgar was aware during those miles of something that had changed between them. The shared purpose of the Wichita trip, the urgency and the problem and the solving of it together, had created a different kind of closeness than the evening porch conversations. They had ridden hard and thought hard and worked a problem together and come out the other side with what they needed, and there was a particular kind of partnership in that, a trust of function and competence, that settled something in Edgar that he had not known was waiting to be settled. On the second evening of the return ride, they made camp by a small stand of elms near a creek crossing, because the next settlement was too far to reach before dark. Edgar built a fire and Pearl made coffee on it, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire in the open Kansas night with the stars overhead in a quantity that was almost argumentative. "I don't think I thanked you," Pearl said. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I want to," she said. She looked at him over the fire. "You didn't have to come with me." "I know I didn't have to," he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "Edgar," she said, When this is settled, Callum and the lien and all of it, what do you want? He looked at the fire. He knew what she was asking. She was asking with the same directness she applied to everything. What is your intention, and where do you see this going, and are we building something, or are you going to ride west after all? I want to stay, he said. On the property. He stopped. Then he said the things he had been thinking in the slow accumulation of all those working days and porch evenings. I want to help you make it work. The farm. I want to be there when the corn comes in this autumn and when the wheat goes in for spring. I want to fix the barn roof before winter because the southwest corner of it is going to leak when the snow comes, and I've been meaning to say so for a month. He looked up from the fire at her face, lit warm by the flames. And I want to be there after that. Pearl held his gaze. How far after that, she asked, and there was something in her voice that was very careful and very honest. As far as there is, he said. She breathed. That's a long time, she said, but she was almost smiling. I know, he said. I don't say things I don't mean. I know you don't, she said. That's one of the things she paused, I love about you. They looked at each other across the campfire in the Kansas night. Pearl, he said, will you marry me? She looked at him steadily. The fire popped and sent a small shower of sparks upward into the dark air. An owl called somewhere in the elm trees one clear note. Yes, she said, I will. He stood up and walked around the fire to her and crouched down beside where she sat and took her hands in both of his. And she looked at him with those green eyes that saw everything clearly and did not look away from hard truths. And he understood that this was the most real thing he had done in over a decade. He kissed her there by the campfire under the Kansas stars, and she kissed him back, and it was better than the first time, which had been very good. Back in Caldwell, Pearl presented Callum with Terrence's formal objection and the documentation from Wellington. She did not do it with drama. She knocked on his door at the Meridian Hotel, handed him the documents, and told him crisply that she intended to contest the lien in the Sumner County Court, and that the legal opinion she had obtained in Wichita was that the challenge would succeed. Callum read the documents. His wide smile underwent a complicated change. He asked for a few days to consult his own advisors. 3 days later, he wrote Pearl a brief letter informing her that, upon review, he was withdrawing the lien claim and wished her success with her agricultural enterprise. It was the letter of a man who has run the numbers and found them unfavorable. Pearl read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at Edgar. Done, she said. Done, he agreed. She pressed her lips together for a moment, and he could see the relief she was allowing herself to feel now that she didn't need to be strategic about it. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him and closed her eyes for a moment. And it was so simple and so complete a gesture that it nearly stopped his heart. They were married in Caldwell in August of 1882, at the small church on the south end of town, whose minister was a practical man named Reverend Hale, who performed the ceremony with sincerity and no unnecessary ceremony. Pearl wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had brought from Missouri for good occasions, and Edgar wore the clean shirt and pressed trousers that represented the formal end of his wardrobe, and they stood before Reverend Hale and the small gathering, the hotel proprietor who had been kind to Pearl, Haysworth the neighboring farmer and his wife, and 2 women from town who had become friendly with Pearl in the month since she arrived, and they said the words. The words Edgar said he meant. Everyone. He had not said words like these in over 10 years, but they came to him with a clarity that surprised him, as if they had been waiting, not lost after all, just held somewhere careful, waiting for the right occasion. When Reverend Hale declared them married and Edgar kissed his wife, Pearl Alden now, though she kept Beckett on the property deed because the land had been Beckett land and she was practical, Mrs. Haysworth cried a little, and Pearl smiled the smile that changed her face, and Edgar felt something that he understood in that moment without any ambivalence at all. He felt like a man who had come to the end of a very long road, and found that the end was not an end at all, but the beginning of a different and better kind of road. After the ceremony, Haysworth's wife had organized a dinner at her house across the fields, with roasted chicken and corn and apple pie from Pearl's own trees, the first apple pie of the season. They ate on the Haysworth porch in the August warmth, and someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard, Caldwell style. Nothing formal, just people moving in the evening air, and Pearl danced with Haysworth and with Reverend Hale, and then she came to Edgar, who was standing at the edge of the dancing with a cup of cider, and she held out her hand. He was not a dancer. She knew this. He took her hand anyway. He held her carefully in the dance, one hand at her waist, one hand holding hers, moving in the approximation of a waltz that was more of a controlled sway, but she did not seem to require anything more refined. She looked up at him with her green eyes and the evening light turning everything golden, and she said, "You're not as bad at this as you claimed." "I claimed nothing," he said. "I said nothing at all on the subject of dancing." "Your face said something," she said. He laughed. He did not laugh often, and it surprised her each time he did, and he could see that it surprised her now, that look of brief and genuine delight. He thought he would spend a considerable amount of the rest of his life trying to cause that particular look. They went home that night, to the property east of Bluff Creek, now truly theirs together, married under Kansas law and under the wide and starry Kansas sky. They drove the cart back from the Haysworth place in the dark, with the sound of the creek growing louder as they approached, and when Pearl stepped down from the cart and walked up the porch steps and turned to look back at him, the lantern she'd taken inside and left burning in the window threw warm light out through the glass, and the apple trees were dark shapes against the star-bright sky. And Edgar Alden stood in the yard of his own property and felt the word assemble itself in his chest with a fullness that was almost more than he could hold. He walked up the porch steps. Pearl had gone inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at the warm, small room, the table where they ate, the iron stove, the two chairs by the window, the jar of wildflowers she had put there a week ago and had not yet replaced, the row of books on the shelf she had arranged the first month, the tin coffee pot on the stove's edge. She came out of the back room and stopped when she saw his face. "Edgar," she said softly. He looked at her. He looked at the room. He looked at her again. "Home," he said. His voice, saying that word, sounded different to him than any voice he had used in a decade. Lower, certain. Like a man who has been carrying a stone for a very long time and has finally, with intention and relief, set it down. Pearl's eyes went bright. She came to him and put her hands on his face and looked at him for a moment with everything she was entirely visible in her expression. The directness and the gentleness and the intelligence and the love, all of it there, nothing held back. "Yes," she said. "Home." He put his arms around her. She put her head against his chest. They stood in the doorway of the house on the 40 acres east of Bluff Creek in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, and the words sat between them like something permanent and true. The corn came in that September, a harvest that was better than Edgar had predicted and very nearly as good as Pearl had hoped. They worked the harvest together with the help of 2 men from town who Edgar had arranged on day wages, and by the time the last of it was in, and the fields were cut back to stubble, they had something to show for the season's work, grain enough to sell and grain enough to keep, and the beginnings of the financial stability that Pearl needed for the farm to stand on its own. She kept her accounts in a ledger she maintained at the kitchen table on the evenings that were too cool for the porch, and Edgar, over her shoulder, learned to read the numbers in her system. She was systematic and honest in her accounting, noting everything, what came in, what went out, what was invested, and what was returned. "We made a profit this season," she told him one October evening, closing the ledger with a precision that communicated satisfaction. "Small, but genuine." "Of course we did," he said. "You run this like a general runs a campaign." "Thank you," she said, taking it as the compliment it was. "I meant it affectionately," he said. "I know," she said, and smiled her smile. He did the barn roof before the winter came, as he had intended, replacing the southwest corner with new timber that he was satisfied would hold against whatever the Kansas winter had in mind. Pearl helped pass the boards up to him while he worked, and they argued in a friendly way about the best angle for the replacement beam, and she was right about the angle, and he told her so without difficulty. Because one of the things he had discovered in the past months was that being right was something Pearl was frequently and matter-of-factly, and he had stopped having any complicated feelings about it. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was cold but not catastrophic. They settled into the rhythms of winter on the farm, the necessary reduction of work, the hours by the stove with books and the ledger, and on the evenings that called for it, conversation of the kind that has no practical purpose and every human one. They talked about Illinois, where Pearl had grown up. They talked about Texas, the parts of it Edgar could discuss without going to the parts he couldn't. They talked about books. Pearl had 20 and Edgar had 4, and they worked through each other's selections with varying degrees of appreciation. They talked about what they wanted from the farm in the coming years. "I'd like another 10 acres under cultivation," Pearl said one February evening. They were at the kitchen table, the stove producing its steady warmth, the winter dark pressed against the windows. "The North Field has potential. Emmett never touched it. The North Field would need work before it could be planted," Edgar said. "The grass is deep and the soil under it is compacted. You'd need to turn it in autumn if you want it ready for spring." "So we start turning it in September," she said. "We could," he said. "Could we afford another hand for the extra work?" She was looking at the ledger. "Let me see," he said, and she pushed the ledger toward him and he looked at the numbers and worked through it, because he had become, over the months, genuinely good at reading her system. "Yes," he said, "if the wheat harvest is anything like last year's corn." "I'm planning on a better wheat harvest than last year's corn," she said firmly, as if she could instruct the weather through sheer precision of expectation. He looked up at her. She was looking at the ledger with the expression she got when she was calculating, the small furrow between her brows, the slight compression of her lips. He had catalogued these expressions over the months the way a surveyor catalogues landmarks precisely and with appreciation. "Pearl," he said. She looked up. "I love you," he said. He said it simply, without preamble, because it was true and because he had been thinking it, and because after a decade of saying nothing that meant anything permanent, he found he wanted to say the things that were true as often as they were true. She looked at him with those clear green eyes and the furrow between her brows eased, and something warm moved across her face. "I love you, Edgar," she said, with the same simplicity, the same direct certainty that she brought to everything she knew to be true. They sat at their kitchen table in their warm house in the Kansas winter, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods by the creek, and the apple trees stood bare in the cold, and the fields lay quiet under the sky waiting for spring, and none of it asked anything of them that night except to be present in it. In March of 1883, Pearl told Edgar that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the day's work had begun, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her expression composed and direct in the way that meant she was telling him something she had already thought through completely and was presenting him with the final, considered version. "I believe it will be October," she said, "based on what I know." He looked at her across the table. He was 32 years old, and he had spent more than a decade believing that the kind of life that included things like children was simply not the life he was going to live. He had been careful with this belief, had packed it away neatly alongside the word he didn't say, had not permitted himself to imagine it. And now Pearl Beckett, Pearl Alden, was sitting across the breakfast table from him in March telling him October, the way she told him everything, directly, with the important information first and the context after. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in his. "Pearl," he said. "I know it's a great deal to," she began. "Pearl," he said, "I am the happiest man in the state of Kansas." She stopped. She looked at him. Something moved through those green eyes that was not her usual composure, something that was closer to the surface, warmer, more vulnerable. "Are you certain?" she asked. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. She breathed. "Good," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Good." He pressed her hands between his and looked up at her face and thought, here then. This is where the road was going all along. It was going here, to this kitchen, to this woman, to this particular morning in March when everything becomes more than you planned for and exactly what you needed. Spring came in fully and with purpose. Pearl continued her work at the farm with, as she put it, appropriate modifications for her condition, meaning she told Edgar which things she was not going to do and proceeded to do everything else at her customary pace. He did not argue with her about which things were on the appropriate modifications list, because he had learned that Pearl Beckett's assessment of her own capabilities was generally accurate, and he trusted it, though he did quietly ensure that none of the heavier work ended up in her vicinity if he could prevent it. They hired a hand for the spring planting season, a quiet young man named Thomas Reedy from a farm 2 counties over who needed work and had been recommended by Haysworth. The north field, which Pearl had planned to bring under cultivation, had been turned in the previous autumn as Edgar had recommended, and this spring it was ready to plant. They put winter wheat in the north field and expanded the corn plot in the lower field. The farm was growing. Pearl's condition was advancing in the way these things do, and with each passing month she became, if possible, more thoroughly herself, more organized, more decided, more cheerful in a focused and purposeful way. She read every book on the subject she could obtain, which in Caldwell were not many, but she wrote to a doctor in Wichita who had been recommended, and received letters from him with information she found satisfying. She made practical preparations with the same systematic intelligence she brought to the farm ledger, and she roped Edgar into each decision with the clear understanding that this was a joint enterprise, and she expected full participation. He participated fully. He found that he did not only want to help, but genuinely wanted to be present for every part of it, which surprised him. He had thought his capacity for this kind of investment had been sealed off. It had not. It had merely been waiting for something real enough to open for. On an October morning in 1883, with the corn harvested and the north field's wheat just establishing itself, and the apple trees heavy with their second full harvest under Pearl's care, their son was born. The doctor from Wichita had come out to the property 5 days before, as arranged, and stayed at the Haysworth place until needed. When the time came he was there, and Edgar was there, and the October morning was clear and cold, and the creek ran loud in the cool air, and the sound that came from inside the house when it was over was the sound of the world rearranging itself into a new configuration. Edgar was in the yard. He had been told to be in the yard. He was not sure how long he had been in the yard. He was looking at the apple trees, which were brilliant red and gold in the October morning, and he was trying to be patient, which was the hardest thing he had ever done. The doctor came to the door. "Mrs. Alden is well," he said. "You have a son." Edgar Alden stood in the yard of the 40 acres east of Bluff Creek in Caldwell, Kansas, and he looked at the sky, and the sky was enormous and brilliant and blue in the particular way of Kansas October, and he breathed in and breathed out, and then he walked into the house. Pearl was in the back room in the bed, with the child. She was tired in a way that was visible in every line of her face, but when he came to the door she turned her head and looked at him, and she was more completely beautiful than he had ever seen her, which was not something he had thought possible. The child was small and red-faced and entirely furious about existing, which Pearl seemed to find funny. "He's perfectly healthy," she said. "The doctor says so. He's just very emphatic about his opinions." "Takes after his mother," Edgar said, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. He held the child, gingerly at first and then with more confidence, the baby's impossible smallness settling against his chest. He looked down at the face, the crumpled, perfect, outraged face of this new person, and felt the whole enormous weight of what this was. "What do we name him?" Pearl asked. They had talked about names, they had a list. He looked at the baby in his arms and knew which name was right. "Emmett," he said, "for your uncle." Pearl's expression went soft and open, and she did not try to conceal it. "Emmett," she said. "Yes." "Emmett Edgar Alden," he said. "Emmett Edgar Alden," she agreed and smiled. He looked at his son. He looked at his wife. He looked at the room, the small back room with the window that faced the apple trees, where Pearl had slept on the first night on the property, and where she now lay in the morning light with their child, named for the man who had given them this beginning. Home, he thought, not even as a word but as a recognition, the way you recognize a landscape you have finally arrived at after a very long journey. Home. The years settled in the way good years do, full and varied, and not without difficulty, but fundamentally sound. Emmett grew from a furious infant into an opinionated toddler into a small boy who had his mother's green eyes and his father's tendency toward silence when something important was being processed, and who was, from a very early age, deeply convinced that the apple trees were personally his. The farm continued to develop. By 1885, they had all 50 acres under cultivation or productive use: the north field, the expanded corn field, the original wheat field, the kitchen garden, the apple orchard that Pearl had expanded with 4 new trees in 1884, and a small kitchen garden that Emmett had been given a row of to manage under supervision. Edgar had added a second barn for winter storage and had rebuilt the original structure's roof entirely. Pearl had expanded the house by 1 room, a proper sitting room on the east side that got the morning light, where the books went, and where, on winter evenings, they read by lamplight while Emmett alternated between sitting in Edgar's lap and conducting experiments with the small set of wooden blocks that Haysworth had made for him. The Caldwell community had become theirs. Not in a dramatic way, neither Pearl nor Edgar were people who required the center of any room, but in the slow, solid way of people who show up consistently and do what they say they will do. Pearl was known in town as a woman of intelligence and fair dealing. Edgar was known as a man of competence and reliability. People came to them for advice about land and planting. Their farm had become a model of what the East of Creek land could produce. In the summer of 1886, Pearl told Edgar she was expecting again. He was less surprised this time and no less glad about it. She was again composed and direct about the information, and again made her practical preparations with systematic efficiency, and in November of 1886, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara. Edgar had wondered when they were choosing names if that name would carry weight for him. It did not. The Clara Hodges of his past was a different story, a closed one, and the name Clara had returned to being simply a name, and it was a good name, and Pearl had suggested it independently because she had a grandmother named Clara, and the symmetry of that seemed right. Clara Alden arrived in November with considerably less outrage than her brother had displayed at the same juncture, and Emmett, who was 3 years old, regarded her arrival with the philosophical acceptance of a person who has been told a thing is going to happen and has prepared himself accordingly. "She's very small," he observed, looking at his sister with his mother's green eyes. "You were also very small," Pearl told him. "I don't remember that," he said, which Pearl found extremely funny. By 1888, the farm was genuinely profitable. Not extravagantly, this was farming in Kansas. Not gold mining, but solidly, sustainably so. Pearl's ledger showed a consistent upward trend, and she managed it with the precision of someone who understood both the opportunity and the fragility of what they had built. Edgar had become, in the years on the land, as thoroughly a farmer as he had once been a cattle driver. He understood the soil of these 40 acres the way he had once understood the terrain of cattle trails, in his body and his hands and his instinct for weather. They were sitting on the porch on a September evening in 1888, the two of them, Emmett and Clara having been put to bed inside, and now the sounds of the farm settling into nighttime, the creek, the occasional sound from the barn, the wind in the cottonwoods. Edgar was in his chair. Pearl was in hers. The same 2 chairs they had owned since their first year. The porch boards he had replaced in 1882 had been replaced again in 1885. The house was larger than it had been. The barn was new. The apple orchard was established and generous, but the porch was the same porch. "Do you remember," Edgar said, "when I walked off this porch and down to the creek and stood there for 10 minutes because you said a word I wasn't ready for?" Pearl turned her head to look at him. "I remember," she said. "I noticed you'd gone and I was not sure if you were going to come back." "I was going to come back," he said. "I just needed a moment." "I know that now," she said. "I wasn't sure then." He looked at the creek through the cottonwoods. The last of the evening light was on the water. "It was a long time before I could say it," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm glad I learned too," he said. She was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way she was sometimes quiet, the way that meant she was holding something carefully before she set it down. "So am I," she said. "More than you know." He reached across the space between their chairs and she met him halfway, her hand in his, and they sat on the porch of their house in the cooling September evening. Inside the house, Emmett Edgar Alden, age 5, stirred in his sleep and was quiet again. Clara Alden, who was nearly 2 and had strong opinions about everything including bedtime, was temporarily silent. The apple trees held their September fruit, heavy and ready for harvest. The fields were golden with the end of the season. The creek ran clear and steady over its familiar stones. Edgar looked at all of it, the dark shape of the barn, the porch boards under his boots, Pearl's hand in his, the lit window of the house where his children were sleeping, the vast and quiet Kansas sky overhead. He did not need to say the word. It was everything that was around him. It was the sound of the creek and the weight of his wife's hand and the smell of the apple trees and the particular creak of the third porch board, and the way Pearl's hair had come loose from its pins, as it always did by evening, in the same left side strand that fell along her jaw. It was not a word anymore. It had become, over 6 years and 2 children and 50 acres of Kansas soil and 1,000 evenings on this porch, the simple and complete fact of where he was and who he was and what he had chosen and what had chosen him. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Above Caldwell, Kansas, the stars came out one by one, and the September night settled over the 50 acres east of Bluff Creek like something that had no intention of ending. The harvest that year was the best they had had, the culmination of 7 years of learning what the land needed and giving it exactly that. Pearl's ledger recorded it with her characteristic lack of ceremony. The numbers were there, they were good numbers. The fact was noted. But on the evening the last of the corn came in, she put the ledger down and looked at Edgar and said, simply, "We did it." And Edgar, who had ridden into Caldwell in the spring of 1882 on a horse headed west, toward nothing in particular, because staying anywhere had seemed beyond him. Edgar looked at his wife in the kitchen of the house they had built together, with the sounds of their children in the next room, and the sound of the creek through the window and the apple trees standing gold and heavy in the evening, and said, "We did." And then their son's voice came from the sitting room, loud with the particular urgency of 5-year-olds. "Papa, Clara has my best block and she won't give it back." And Clara's answer was immediate and emphatic and entirely wordless, which was her current preferred mode of communication. Pearl looked at Edgar with the laughter she was containing so as to set a good parental example. Edgar stood up and went to adjudicate the situation, which involved 2 small children, 1 wooden block, and a negotiation that would have done credit to Tarrant the Wichita lawyer. Clara relinquished the block in exchange for being held, which was her real aim. Emmett, restored to his property, immediately decided the block was not that important and went back to his other construction project. Edgar stood in the sitting room with Clara on his hip, looking at his son's serious engineering efforts and feeling the full, warm, specific weight of this life, the completely ordinary and completely extraordinary weight of it. Pearl appeared in the doorway. "Block crisis resolved," she said. "Block crisis resolved," he said. She came and stood beside him, and Clara reached for her mother, and Pearl took her, and the child's gold auburn hair, Pearl's color. Her exact color was soft against Pearl's cheek. "Bedtime," Pearl said firmly to both children. Emmett looked up from his blocks. "5 more minutes," he said, which was Pearl's own precision turned back on her and which she recognized completely. "5 minutes," she said. "Exactly." 5 minutes later to the second she said, "Time," and there was no argument, because in the Alden household you did not argue with the timer. Edgar and Pearl tucked them in together, as they always did Emmett first, in his room that had been built for him when Clara arrived. Then Clara in the smaller room that had been Pearl's when she first came to the property. Clara went to sleep with the immediate confidence of someone who has decided sleep is acceptable for now. Emmett asked 3 questions about farming, about stars, about why creek water moved, and received 3 genuine answers, and then closed his eyes. They went back to the porch. Pearl carried the last of the coffee from the stove and poured it into 2 cups, and they sat in their chairs in the night that was cool and full of stars. Edgar looked at the sky. He thought about the road he had ridden, the long one, the road that had come through Millbrook and through a decade of going west, of not staying anywhere, of not letting himself mean the things that required permanence. He thought about a woman on the steps of the Meridian Hotel with a busted carpetbag and fire in her eyes. He thought about a word said casually through an open window, and about standing at the edge of the creek trying to breathe. He thought about the night by the campfire outside Wichita, and about Reverend Hale saying the words, and about October mornings and December evenings and all the particular Septembers of this life. He thought about a 5-year-old boy who had his mother's green eyes, and about a girl who had her mother's hair, and who had already, at nearly 2, developed a personality of formidable independence that was going to require every bit of skill they possessed. He thought about the barn roof he had replaced and the south fence he had first repaired and the porch board under his boots and the apple trees beyond the yard and the creek beyond the apple trees, running over its same familiar stones. "Pearl," he said. She said, looking at the stars, "I need to tell you something." She turned her head to look at him, attentive. "When I rode into Caldwell in 1882, he said, "I had no plan. I had a direction, which was west, and I had a reason for that direction, which was that I had left everything behind and had nowhere else to go. I was not a man who was going to stop." He looked at her. "And then you were standing on those steps and your bag fell open and I stopped." She was watching him quietly. "I have never," he said, "in all the time since not one single day wished that I hadn't stopped." Pearl set her coffee cup down on the porch rail very carefully. She turned to him fully in her chair. "Edgar Alden," she said. "Pearl Alden," he said. She stood up from her chair and came to his, and he shifted to make room, and she sat beside him in the same chair, which was a close fit but a manageable one, and she put her head against his shoulder and his arm went around her. They sat that way in the September night, 2 people on a porch in Caldwell, Kansas, in 1888, with 50 acres of good Kansas land and 2 sleeping children and the sound of the creek and the sound of the stars, which is not a sound anyone can hear but which is present nonetheless in the large quiet of the prairie night. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. The cottonwoods moved in the light wind off the plain. The apple trees were still. The creek ran clear over its stones in the dark. The house held its warmth and its sleeping children with the solid confidence of a structure that has been well cared for and knows it. Edgar Alden put his cheek against his wife's hair and closed his eyes. He was home. He had come home. He was, at last and thoroughly and without reservation, exactly and entirely home.